where small-town secrets hide behind festival smiles. Tonight, we're diving into 11 experiences that will make you question every quaint celebration you've ever attended. Picture this. You're at a harvest festival when you notice all the scarecrows have human teeth. You're enjoying apple butter that tastes metallic, only to discover bones mixed in the compost. You hear whispers coming from inside the pumpkins you're about to carve. These are the moments when innocent festival fun transforms into something far more sinister. From corn mazes that digest visitors alive to cherry blossoms that bloom from buried bodies. Tonight's collection reveals what happens when traditional celebrations mask horrifying secrets. Each account comes from someone who thought they were just enjoying a small-town festival, until they realized they had become part of a much darker tradition. So grab your favorite snack, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself for 11 festival experiences that will forever change how you view community gatherings. Let's begin with Olivia Grace's visit to what seemed like the perfect harvest celebration in rural Iowa. I should have realized something was wrong when I noticed all the scarecrows had human teeth embedded in their burlap faces. But I was too focused on my assignment to pay attention to the warning signs that Millbrook, Iowa, was hiding something far more sinister than a simple harvest celebration. My name is Olivia Grace, and I'm an agricultural journalist who specializes in documenting traditional farming communities across the Midwest. When my editor at Farm and Field magazine assigned me to cover Millbrook's annual Harvest Moon Festival, I thought it would be another straightforward piece about small-town America preserving its agricultural heritage. The town had a population of exactly 847 people, surrounded by endless cornfields that stretched to every horizon. It seemed like the perfect setting for a heartwarming story about community traditions. I arrived on a crisp October afternoon, 3 days before the festival was set to begin. The town square was already bustling with preparation activities. Vendors were setting up booths selling homemade preserves, hand-carved wooden crafts, and what appeared to be the most elaborate corn maze I'd ever seen. The smell of apple cider and pumpkin spice filled the air, creating that perfect autumn atmosphere that city folks like me rarely get to experience. The locals were friendly enough at first. Mayor Patricia Henley, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, gave me a thorough tour of the festival grounds. She explained how the Harvest Moon Festival had been a Millbrook tradition for over a century, dating back to when the town was first established by German immigrants in the 1890s. Every family in town participated, she told me, and they took great pride in maintaining the authentic customs their ancestors had brought from the old country. But as the days passed, I began noticing peculiarities that made me increasingly uncomfortable. The scarecrows positioned throughout the town weren't just unusual because of their human teeth, though that detail alone should have sent me running. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I walked past, and I could swear I sometimes heard faint whispers coming from their direction when the wind blew through the cornfields. When I mentioned this to Mrs. Henley, she simply smiled and said the wind could play tricks on outsiders who weren't used to the wide open spaces. The festival officially began on Friday evening with what they called the Blessing of the Harvest. The entire town gathered in the central square as the sun set, creating long shadows that danced eerily across the faces of the assembled crowd. I noticed that many of the older residents wore identical silver pendants shaped like corn stalks, and they would touch these pendants whenever they spoke about the harvest or the festival traditions. Father McKinnon, the local parish priest, led a prayer that seemed oddly pagan for a Catholic ceremony, speaking about appeasing the spirits of the earth and ensuring the continued fertility of the soil. During the blessing ceremony, I tried to interview several longtime residents about the festival's history, but their responses were eerily similar. as if they had all rehearsed the same script. They spoke about sacrifice and tradition, about the importance of giving back to the earth that sustained them, and about how some customs were too sacred to share with outsiders. When I pressed for more specific details about the festival's origins, their friendly demeanor would shift to something much colder, and they would abruptly end our conversations. On Saturday morning, I decided to explore the cornfields surrounding the town to get some atmospheric photographs for my article. The corn stood nearly 8 feet tall, creating narrow corridors between the rows that blocked out most of the sunlight. As I walked deeper into the maze-like fields, I began finding disturbing evidence that this wasn't just an ordinary farming community. Scattered among the corn stalks were small piles of bones, too many to belong to the usual farm animals, and some that looked disturbingly human in shape and size. When I examined the scarecrows more closely, my blood ran cold. The teeth embedded in their faces weren't plastic props or animal teeth as I had assumed. They were definitely human molars and incisors, yellowed with age but unmistakably real. Worse still, the hair used to stuff their heads wasn't straw or synthetic material. It was human hair in various colors and textures, some of it still attached to pieces of scalp. I tried to leave town that afternoon, but my car wouldn't start. The local mechanic, a burly man named Tom Morrison, diagnosed the problem as a completely dead battery and several severed brake lines. He claimed it would take at least 3 days to get the necessary parts, coincidentally keeping me in town through the festival's final ceremony on Sunday night. When I suggested calling for a tow truck or rental car, Morrison informed me that the nearest services were over 100 miles away, and they didn't deliver to Millbrook. By Saturday evening, I had become convinced that something terrible was going to happen during Sunday's closing ceremony, which the townspeople referred to as the Corn King celebration. I tried calling my editor and several friends from my hotel room, but discovered that all phone lines out of town had mysteriously gone dead. My cell phone showed no signal, despite having full bars when I first arrived in Millbrook. Sunday afternoon brought the festival's climax. The entire town gathered around a massive bonfire built in the center of the cornfields, with the towering scarecrows arranged in a perfect circle around the flames. Mayor Henley announced that this year's festival was extra special because they had been blessed with a perfect offering, someone who had come to them willingly, drawn by forces beyond their understanding. As the sun began to set, I realized with growing horror that I was the offering they were referring to. The friendly townspeople who had welcomed me just days earlier now surrounded me with expressions of grim determination. They explained that every 7 years, their harvest ritual required a sacrifice to ensure the continued fertility of their crops. The scarecrows I had been photographing were the preserved remains of previous offerings, their human elements incorporated into the guardians that watched over the fields year-round. Mayor Henley's kind grandmother facade dropped away completely as she detailed how they had been luring agricultural journalists and other visitors to serve as sacrifices for decades. My editor hadn't assigned me this story randomly. He had received an anonymous tip suggesting Millbrook would be perfect for my type of reporting. The town had carefully researched my background and interests, crafting the perfect bait to draw me to their festival. The ritual itself was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. They didn't simply kill their sacrifices. They transformed them into scarecrows while still conscious, sewing living people into burlap skins and positioning them throughout the fields to serve as eternal guardians. The whispers I had heard from the scarecrows weren't wind tricks. They were the voices of previous victims, trapped in their cloth prisons and unable to die. As the townspeople began preparing the materials for my transformation, I could hear the other scarecrows calling out to me from their positions around the bonfire. Some had been there for decades, their voices barely audible whispers begging for death that would never come. They told me about their own experiences of being lured to Millbrook, about the slow realization that they would never leave, and about the endless years of consciousness trapped within their straw and cloth bodies. The last thing I remember clearly was the sensation of the burlap being sewn around my still living flesh, the rough material scraping against my skin as they positioned me in the fields with the others. Mayor Henley whispered that I should feel honored to become part of Millbrook's most sacred tradition, that my sacrifice would ensure bountiful harvests for years to come. Now I stand in these cornfields, watching new visitors arrive for each year's festival, trying to warn them with whispers that most dismiss as wind through the stalks. My voice grows weaker with each passing season, but I continue to hope that someday, someone will listen to our warnings and escape before becoming another guardian in Millbrook's horrifying harvest tradition. The carnival workers weren't supposed to have glowing eyes, but I didn't realize that until it was far too late to run. What I thought was just another gig, setting up rides in a small Oregon logging town, turned into the longest night of my life. Watching people transform into something that defied every law of nature, I thought I understood. My name is Oliver Thomas, and I've spent the last 15 years working traveling carnivals across the Pacific Northwest. It's not glamorous work, but it pays decent money and keeps me moving, which suits my restless personality just fine. I've seen every type of small-town America has to offer, from wealthy resort communities to dying industrial cities. And I thought I'd encountered every variety of local oddity and regional quirk imaginable. Pine Haven, Oregon seemed like just another logging town trying to celebrate the summer solstice with a traditional carnival, complete with a Ferris wheel, bumper cars, and the usual collection of game booths and food vendors. The town sat nestled in a valley surrounded by towering Douglas firs, with a population that couldn't have exceeded 2,000 people. Most of the residents worked for the local timber company or in supporting businesses, and they had that weathered, practical look of people who make their living from the land. When our carnival convoy rolled into town on June 19th, 3 days before the solstice celebration, we were greeted with the kind of enthusiastic welcome that small communities reserve for special events that break up the monotony of rural life. Setting up the carnival went smoothly at first. The locals were helpful, offering to assist with everything from electrical connections to clearing debris from the midway. They seemed genuinely excited about the festivities, talking constantly about how important the solstice celebration was to their community and how they looked forward to it all year long. Mayor Davidson, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and an easy smile, explained that the Midsummer Carnival had been a Pine Haven tradition for over 50 years, though he was vague about the specific origins of the celebration. But as we worked to prepare the carnival grounds, I began noticing things that didn't quite add up. For one thing, none of the townspeople seemed to have any intention of leaving once the carnival opened. Usually, local communities would enjoy the festivities for a few hours each evening and then head home. But the Pine Haven residents appeared to be settling in for the duration. They brought sleeping bags, camping chairs, and enough food to last for days, setting up what looked like a permanent encampment around the carnival perimeter. Even stranger was their behavior toward the carnival visitors from neighboring towns. Pine Haven wasn't exactly a tourist destination, but word had spread about the solstice celebration, and people were driving in from communities as far as 100 miles away to enjoy the carnival. The locals were almost possessively friendly toward these visitors, insisting on personally guiding them through every attraction, buying them food and drinks, and encouraging them to stay as late as possible each night. By the second evening, I realized that none of the out-of-town visitors were actually leaving. When I asked my supervisor about it, he just shrugged and said people sometimes got caught up in the carnival atmosphere and decided to make a weekend of it. But I had been working carnivals long enough to know that wasn't normal behavior. Families with young children don't typically camp out at traveling carnivals. And the number of visitors who claimed to be staying at local hotels far exceeded the town's actual lodging capacity. The night of June 21st, the summer solstice, everything changed. As darkness fell, I noticed that many of the Pinehaven residents were wearing identical wooden pendants carved with symbols that looked like some combination of Celtic knotwork and Native American designs. When I asked Mayor Davidson about the pendants, he explained that they were traditional solstice charms that had been passed down through generations of families in the area, though he couldn't or wouldn't elaborate on their specific meaning or origin. Around 10 o'clock, as the carnival reached its peak activity level, I began to notice changes in the townspeople's appearance. It started subtly. Their eyes seemed brighter than usual, almost luminescent in the colored lights of the carnival rides. Their movements became more fluid and coordinated, as if they were all following some unheard rhythm or responding to signals that only they could perceive. Most disturbing of all, they began positioning themselves strategically throughout the carnival grounds, effectively surrounding all the visitors without appearing to do so deliberately. The first clear sign that something was terribly wrong came when I tried to shut down the Tilt-A-Whirl for routine maintenance around 11:30. The ride continued operating despite being disconnected from its power source, the cars spinning and tilting with mechanical precision that should have been impossible without electricity. When I investigated further, I discovered that several other rides were exhibiting the same phenomenon. The carousel horses continued their endless circuit. The Ferris wheel kept turning, and the bumper cars moved in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. As midnight approached, the transformation of Pinehaven's residents became impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Their eyes now glowed with a pale blue light that was clearly visible even in the bright carnival illumination. Their skin took on a translucent quality that revealed dark veins pulsing beneath the surface, and their movements became predatory and coordinated in a way that reminded me of pack hunters stalking prey. The visitors from other towns seemed oblivious to these changes, continuing to enjoy the carnival attractions with the kind of carefree abandon that comes from vacation excitement. But I could see that they were being systematically herded and isolated, guided away from the carnival exits and toward the darker areas of the midway, where the game booths created shadowy corridors between the bright ride areas. I tried to warn some of the visitors, approaching a family from Portland who were waiting in line for the Ferris wheel. But when I attempted to point out the strange behavior of the locals, they looked at me with blank expressions and insisted that everything seemed perfectly normal. It was as if they were under some kind of hypnotic influence that prevented them from recognizing the danger they were in. By 12:30, the systematic hunting had begun in earnest. The transformed townspeople moved through the carnival with inhuman grace and speed, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like searchlights. They cornered visitors in groups of 3 or 4, cutting off escape routes with the efficiency of experienced predators. The carnival music continued playing. The rides kept operating, and the bright lights flashed in their programmed sequences, creating a surreal backdrop for the horror that was unfolding. I watched from my hiding place behind the cotton candy stand as Mayor Davidson shed his human appearance entirely, revealing something that looked like a cross between a wolf and a shadow, with elongated limbs and teeth that gleamed like polished obsidian. The other residents underwent similar transformations, becoming creatures that retained some human characteristics, but were clearly something else entirely. Something that had been masquerading as human for decades, or perhaps centuries. The most terrifying aspect of the entire experience was the methodical nature of their hunt. These weren't mindless monsters driven by bloodlust or hunger. They worked together with intelligence and purpose, communicating through sounds that resembled language, but contained harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. They seemed to be following some kind of ritual or ceremony, taking their victims in a specific order that might have been determined by age, health, or some other criteria I couldn't understand. As the night progressed, I realized that the carnival itself was part of their hunting strategy. The rides and attractions weren't just continuing to operate despite being unpowered. They were actively participating in the hunt, trapping visitors and delivering them to the waiting creatures. The Ferris wheel would stop with certain cars at the top, leaving passengers stranded and helpless. The funhouse mirrors reflected not the visitors' appearances, but the true forms of the creatures pursuing them. Even the game booths had become traps, with prizes that moved and grabbed at anyone who came within reach. I managed to survive the night by staying hidden and moving carefully between shadowy areas. But I was forced to watch as every single out-of-town visitor was systematically captured. The creatures didn't kill their prey immediately. Instead, they seemed to be feeding on something intangible, drawing some kind of life energy or essence from their victims before finally ending their lives in the early hours of the morning. As dawn broke over Pinehaven, the creatures began reverting to their human appearances. The carnival rides finally stopped operating, the lights dimmed, and the music faded away. Mayor Davidson and the other residents resumed their normal appearances and began cleaning up the carnival grounds as if nothing unusual had happened. They disposed of the evidence with practiced efficiency, and by full daylight, Pinehaven looked like any other small logging town recovering from a successful community celebration. I left town that morning without saying goodbye to anyone, driving my truck far beyond the speed limit until I had put several hundred miles between myself and that cursed valley. But even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with the memory of those glowing eyes and the sound of inhuman voices coordinating their hunt. I've never worked another carnival job, but I still watch the news for reports of missing persons around small towns during solstice celebrations, wondering how many other communities are hiding similar secrets behind their friendly facades. The metallic aftertaste in my mouth should have been my first warning, but I was too busy writing notes about authentic Pennsylvania Dutch cooking to realize I was consuming something far more sinister than traditional apple butter. It wasn't until I found the human molars mixed in with the apple pulp that I understood why the entire town of Sweetwater Valley had been so insistent that I sample every single dish at their annual festival. I'm Emma Rose, and I run a food blog called Heritage Flavors that focuses on documenting authentic American culinary traditions before they disappear completely. My readers love stories about family recipes passed down through generations, traditional cooking methods, and the cultural significance of regional foods. When I received an invitation to cover Apple Butter Days in Sweetwater Valley, Pennsylvania, I was thrilled. The festival promised to showcase traditional Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch cooking techniques that had remained unchanged for over 2 centuries. Sweetwater Valley was tucked away in Lancaster County, surrounded by rolling hills covered with apple orchards that stretched as far as the eye could see. The community consisted of about 300 families, most of whom belonged to Old Order Amish or Mennonite sects that maintained strict traditional lifestyles. The town square featured a collection of white-painted buildings with simple architecture, anchored by a massive red barn that served as the festival's main venue. Everything about the setting seemed picture-perfect for the type of authentic cultural documentation my blog readers craved. The festival organizer, a woman named Rebecca Stoltzfus, met me at the edge of town with a horse-drawn buggy that would serve as my transportation during my 3-day stay. She was in her 40s, dressed in traditional plain clothing with her hair covered by a white bonnet. And she spoke with the gentle accent characteristic of Pennsylvania German communities. Rebecca explained that Apple Butter Days had been a Sweetwater Valley tradition for over 150 years, celebrating the autumn harvest and preserving techniques that allowed the community to store food through the harsh winter months. The festival began early Friday morning with what Rebecca called the sacred stirring ceremony. The entire community gathered around enormous copper kettles that had been passed down through generations, each one capable of holding over 100 gallons of apple butter. The kettles sat over wood fires that had been burning since before dawn, and the air was thick with the sweet smell of cooking apples mixed with cinnamon, nutmeg, and other traditional spices. What struck me immediately was the community's insistence that I taste every single batch of apple butter being prepared. Each family had their own secret recipe, passed down through generations and supposedly containing unique combinations of spices and cooking techniques. The festival participants were almost aggressive in their hospitality, pressing sample after sample into my hands and watching carefully to ensure I swallowed every bite. The first batch I tried was prepared by the Miller family, who had been living in Sweetwater Valley since the 1850s. The apple butter was darker than any I had ever seen, with a rich, complex flavor that included notes I couldn't quite identify. There was a distinctive metallic aftertaste that lingered on my tongue, which the Millers explained was due to the copper kettles and traditional cooking methods their ancestors had brought from Germany. As the morning progressed, I sampled apple butter from over a dozen different families, each claiming their recipe was the most authentic and traditional. The metallic taste became more pronounced with each sample, and I began to feel slightly nauseous, though I attributed this to consuming too much sugar on an empty stomach. The festival participants seemed pleased with my enthusiasm, nodding approvingly as I took detailed notes about their ingredients and preparation methods. Around midday, Rebecca suggested I tour the apple orchards to see where the fruit was grown and harvested. The orchards were beautiful, with neat rows of mature trees heavy with red and golden apples. But as we walked between the trees, I began noticing things that seemed inconsistent with traditional organic farming methods. The soil was darker and richer than normal, with an unusual texture that felt almost greasy beneath my feet. When I bent down to examine the soil more closely, I found small white objects mixed in with the dirt around the tree roots. At first, I assumed they were limestone chips used to adjust soil pH. But closer inspection revealed that they were fragments of bone. Some pieces were clearly from animals, but others had the distinctive shape and density of human bones. When I pointed this out to Rebecca, she explained that the community practiced traditional composting methods that included all organic materials, though she was vague about the specific details. That evening, the festival featured a communal dinner where every dish was prepared using ingredients grown in Sweetwater Valley. The apple butter was served with fresh bread, roasted pork, and vegetables from the community gardens. The meat had the same metallic taste I had noticed in the apple butter, and it was more tender than any pork I had ever eaten, practically falling off the bone with minimal chewing required. During dinner, I sat with the Yoder family, who had been farming in the valley for 4 generations. Old Samuel Yoder, the family patriarch, told stories about the early days of the settlement, when winters were harsh and food was scarce. He spoke about the importance of using every available resource, wasting nothing that could provide nutrition, and making sacrifices to ensure the community's survival. As Samuel talked, I noticed that several of the older residents were missing teeth, and those who still had full sets of teeth often had gaps where molars had been removed. When I asked about dental care in the community, Rebecca explained that they practiced traditional medicine and often extracted teeth that became problematic, but something about her explanation felt rehearsed and incomplete. Saturday morning brought the festival's highlight event, the Apple Butter Queen competition. Young women from the community competed to see who could prepare the most authentic and flavorful apple butter using traditional methods. The competition was taken very seriously, with judges evaluating everything from ingredient selection to stirring technique to final taste. I was honored to serve as one of the guest judges, alongside several community elders who had been making apple butter for decades. The competition entries were uniformly excellent, but I began to notice disturbing patterns in the preparation methods. Several contestants added ingredients that looked suspiciously like ground bone meal to their apple mixtures, claiming these were traditional spice blends passed down from their grandmothers. The winning entry was prepared by a young woman named Mary Byler, whose apple butter had the richest, most complex flavor I had ever experienced. But as I was congratulating Mary on her victory, I bit down on something hard in my sample. When I discreetly spit it into my napkin, I found myself looking at a human molar, complete with silver filling. That evening, I decided to investigate the community's food preparation areas more thoroughly. After the festival participants had gone to bed, I snuck into the main barn where the apple butter kettles were stored. Using my phone's flashlight, I examined the residue in the bottom of several kettles and made discoveries that turned my stomach. Mixed in with the apple pulp and spices were fragments of human bone, teeth, and what appeared to be pieces of dried flesh. The traditional recipes that these families had been guarding so carefully weren't just using unusual spices. They were incorporating human remains into their food preparation. The metallic taste I had been noticing wasn't from copper kettles. It was from blood and bone meal derived from human sources. I also found a hidden room beneath the barn that contained dozens of barrels filled with what appeared to be fermenting organic matter. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of rotting meat and preserving spices that made me gag. Several barrels were labeled with names and dates going back decades, suggesting that this practice had been continuing for generations. The most horrifying discovery was a handwritten ledger that documented the community's harvest schedule for the past 50 years. The entries described a systematic process of selecting visitors, elderly community members, and others deemed suitable for contributing to the community's sustenance. The ledger made it clear that the Apple Butter Days Festival served as both a celebration and a recruitment opportunity, drawing food bloggers and cultural enthusiasts who could be easily incorporated into their traditional preservation methods. Sunday morning, I tried to leave Sweetwater Valley as quietly as possible, but found that my car had been disabled overnight. Rebecca appeared at my lodging with another horse-drawn buggy, insisting that I stay for the festival's closing ceremony. She explained that it would be rude to leave before experiencing the complete traditional celebration, and that the community had prepared special honors for their distinguished guest food blogger. The closing ceremony took place in the main barn, with the entire community gathered around tables laden with every variety of preserved food they had prepared over the weekend. Rebecca announced that I had been selected as this year's special contributor to their traditional preservation methods, an honor that would ensure my recipes and food knowledge would be preserved forever as part of their community heritage. As the community members surrounded me with expressions of grim determination, Rebecca explained how food bloggers and culinary experts had been contributing to their traditional recipes for decades. My expertise and enthusiasm for authentic cooking methods made me perfect for incorporation into their apple butter and other preserved foods, ensuring that my knowledge would nourish the community for years to come. The last thing I remember clearly was the taste of apple butter being forced down my throat. But this batch had a flavor I finally recognized. It was my own blood, already being prepared for next year's Apple Butter Days Festival, where another unsuspecting food blogger would sample traditional recipes that contained far more than just apples and spices. The whispers started the moment I picked up my carving knife. But I thought it was just the wind, until I realized the voices were coming from inside the pumpkins themselves. What I discovered in that New England pumpkin patch made me understand why some historical injustices refuse to stay buried, no matter how many centuries pass. My name is Elijah Michael, and I'm a freelance photographer who specializes in documenting American folk traditions and seasonal celebrations. October is my busiest month, traveling from town to town, capturing the essence of Halloween festivities across New England. When I received an invitation to photograph the annual Pumpkin Patch Festival in Thornfield, Massachusetts, I was immediately intrigued by the town's claim that their celebration was the most authentic Halloween experience in all of New England. Thornfield was a colonial town established in 1672, nestled in the Berkshire Hills about an hour west of Springfield. The town square was dominated by a white steepled church and surrounded by well-preserved colonial buildings that gave the entire community an almost museum-like quality. The population had remained stable at around 200 residents for over 50 years. And many families could trace their ancestry back to the original colonial settlers. The town's main attraction was Blackwood Farm, a 200-acre property that had been converted into an elaborate pumpkin patch and Halloween attraction. The farm boasted over 30 varieties of pumpkins, ranging from tiny decorative gourds to massive Atlantic giant specimens that weighed over 500 pounds. According to the festival organizers, the soil conditions in Thornfield were uniquely suited for growing pumpkins, producing specimens that were both larger and more vibrant than those grown in neighboring communities. I arrived on October 29th, 2 days before Halloween, when the festival was reaching its peak activity level. The farm was bustling with families selecting pumpkins for carving, children navigating corn mazes, and vendors selling hot cider and caramel apples. The atmosphere was exactly what I had hoped to capture. Pure Americana, with all the warmth and tradition that makes small-town Halloween celebrations so appealing. The festival director, a woman named Margaret Blackwood, who claimed to be a descendant of the farm's original owners, gave me a comprehensive tour of the grounds. She was particularly proud of the pumpkin patch itself, explaining how her family had been perfecting their growing techniques for generations. The pumpkins were indeed extraordinary, perfectly shaped, with deep orange color and sturdy stems that made them ideal for carving. What struck me as unusual was Margaret's insistence that all pumpkin carving must take place on the farm premises. She explained that this was a long-standing tradition designed to ensure that the jack-o'-lanterns would have the proper spiritual connection to the soil where the pumpkins were grown. Families were encouraged to bring their carving tools and work at communal tables set up throughout the pumpkin patch, creating their Halloween decorations in the same location where the pumpkins had been harvested. As I photographed families engaged in pumpkin carving, I began noticing strange acoustic phenomena throughout the farm. There seemed to be a constant low-level murmuring that I initially attributed to the conversations of dozens of families working in close proximity. But when I listened more carefully, I realized that the sounds weren't coming from the people around me. They were emanating from the ground itself, as if voices were speaking from somewhere beneath the pumpkin patch. The first clear indication that something was seriously wrong came when I was photographing a young mother helping her daughter carve a traditional jack-o'-lantern face. As they cut into the pumpkin, a distinctly human voice whispered, "Help me," from inside the gourd. Both the mother and daughter heard it clearly, but Margaret Blackwood quickly appeared and explained that the farm's unique acoustics sometimes created echo effects that could sound like voices. Over the course of the afternoon, similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency. Multiple families reported hearing voices from inside their pumpkins, always pleading for help or crying out in apparent distress. The voices seemed to be those of women and children, speaking in accents and using phrases that sounded distinctly colonial in origin. Margaret continued to dismiss these reports as acoustic illusions, but I could see that many festival participants were becoming genuinely disturbed by the experiences. That evening, I decided to return to the pumpkin patch after the festival had closed to investigate the voice phenomena more thoroughly. Using professional audio recording equipment, I documented over 2 hours of distinct voices emanating from various locations throughout the patch. The voices were clearly human, speaking in archaic English dialects and describing experiences of terror, persecution, and unjust death. My research into Thornfield's history revealed information that the town's promotional materials conveniently omitted. Between 1692 and 1694, during the height of the Salem witch trial hysteria, Thornfield had conducted its own witch trials that resulted in the execution of 23 women and children, unlike Salem, where most victims were hanged. Thornfield had burned its accused witches alive in a field that corresponded exactly to the current location of Blackwood Farm's pumpkin patch. The historical records indicated that the trials in Thornfield had been particularly brutal and unjust, targeting primarily widows, elderly women, and young girls whose families had fallen into disfavor with the town's religious leadership. The accused were denied proper legal representation and were subjected to tortures designed to extract confessions of witchcraft. Most disturbing of all, the trials had continued for over 2 years after Salem had ended its own witch trial proceedings, suggesting that Thornfield's persecution had been motivated more by personal vendettas and property disputes than by genuine religious fervor. On Halloween night, the festival reached its climax with what Margaret called the Great Lighting Ceremony. Hundreds of carved jack-o'-lanterns were arranged throughout the pumpkin patch and lit simultaneously at midnight, creating a spectacular display that was supposed to honor the spirits of Halloween. As the candles were lit, the voices from within the pumpkins became louder and more desperate, creating a cacophony of pleas for justice and cries of anguish that could no longer be dismissed as acoustic illusions. The most terrifying moment came when the jack-o'-lanterns began moving on their own, rolling across the ground and positioning themselves in patterns that spelled out the names of the women and children who had been executed during Thornfield's witch trials. The carved faces seemed to come alive, their expressions changing from the traditional Halloween grins to looks of agony and desperation that perfectly matched the voices crying out from within. As the night progressed, the spiritual manifestations intensified beyond anything I had ever witnessed or imagined possible. The jack-o'-lanterns began levitating, floating through the air in coordinated formations that resembled funeral processions. The voices became more coherent, telling individual stories of innocence betrayed and lives cut short by superstition and cruelty. I learned that the extraordinary fertility of Thornfield's soil wasn't due to natural conditions. It was the result of centuries of spiritual energy from the executed victims, whose bodies had been buried in unmarked graves throughout the area that became Blackwood Farm. The pumpkins grown in this soil absorbed the spiritual essence of the murdered women and children, becoming vessels for their trapped souls. Margaret Blackwood finally revealed the truth about her family's role in the town's dark history. The Blackwoods had been among the most aggressive prosecutors during the witch trials, using accusations of witchcraft to seize property and eliminate rivals. Her ancestors had deliberately established their farm on the execution site, believing that the spiritual energy of the victims would make their crops more productive and profitable. For over 3 centuries, the Blackwood family had been cultivating pumpkins that contained the trapped souls of witch trial victims, selling them to unsuspecting families for Halloween celebrations. Each carved jack-o'-lantern became a temporary vessel that allowed the spirits to communicate with the living world, but only for the brief period between carving and the pumpkin's decay. The festival's true purpose wasn't to celebrate Halloween traditions. It was to provide the maximum number of carved pumpkins that would give voice to the victims of Thornfield's historical injustices. Margaret had been documenting these spiritual communications for decades. But instead of seeking to help the trapped souls find peace, she had been using their testimonies to write a book about the witch trials that would bring her academic recognition and financial profit. As dawn approached on November 1st, the jack-o'-lanterns began to decay rapidly, their carved features collapsing as the spiritual energy that animated them was released back into the soil. The voices faded to whispers and then to silence, leaving behind only rotting pumpkin shells and the lingering smell of candle smoke mixed with something that reminded me of burning flesh. I left Thornfield that morning with hundreds of photographs and hours of audio recordings that documented the most extraordinary supernatural phenomena I had ever encountered. But I also left with the knowledge that some historical injustices create spiritual wounds that refuse to heal. No matter how many centuries pass or how many Halloween celebrations try to transform sites of tragedy into sources of seasonal entertainment. When I touched what I thought was an ice sculpture and felt a pulse beneath my fingertips, I realized that Frostbite Falls had found a solution to their harsh winters that was far more horrifying than freezing to death. The perfectly preserved people weren't art. They were neighbors, friends, and family members who had volunteered to sleep through the coldest months, never knowing they might never wake up again. My name is Ava Elizabeth, and I'm a professional ice sculptor who has spent the last decade creating commission pieces for luxury hotels, corporate events, and art installations across North America. When I received an invitation to serve as a judge for the Winter Solstice Ice Festival in Frostbite Falls, Alaska, I was intrigued by the opportunity to experience ice carving in one of the most extreme cold weather environments on the continent. Frostbite Falls was located 200 miles north of Anchorage, accessible only by small aircraft during the winter months when the roads became impassable. The town had a year-round population of approximately 400 residents, though this number fluctuated dramatically based on seasonal employment in fishing, mining, and tourism industries. The community had been established in the 1920s as a gold mining outpost, but had evolved into a subsistence-based society that relied heavily on traditional skills and community cooperation to survive the brutal Arctic winters. The town's isolation was complete from November through March, when temperatures regularly dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and blizzards could last for weeks at a time. Supply flights were infrequent and weather-dependent, meaning that residents needed to be completely self-sufficient for months at a time. This extreme isolation had created a tight-knit community with customs and traditions that were unlike anything I had encountered in more accessible locations. The festival organizer, a man named Viktor Petrov, who claimed to be descended from Russian fur traders, met me at the tiny airstrip with a dog sled team that would serve as my primary transportation during my week-long stay. Viktor was in his 60s, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent decades surviving in harsh conditions. And he spoke with a slight accent that reflected the community's mixed heritage of Russian, Native Alaskan, and American influences. As we traveled through the town, I was impressed by the elaborate ice sculptures that had been positioned throughout the community. The level of artistry was extraordinary, with pieces that demonstrated technical skills comparable to anything I had seen in major metropolitan art installations. The sculptures depicted human figures in various poses and activities. Families gathered around dinner tables, children playing in snow, couples embracing, and individuals engaged in daily tasks like cooking and reading. What made these sculptures truly remarkable was their incredible attention to detail. The faces were so lifelike that they seemed to capture not just physical features, but individual personalities and emotions. The clothing appeared to be carved with such precision that individual fabric textures were visible, and some sculptures even included accessories like eyeglasses, jewelry, and hair ornaments that looked completely authentic. Victor explained that ice carving had become the community's primary form of artistic expression during the long winter months, with residents spending hundreds of hours perfecting their techniques and competing to create the most realistic human figures possible. He claimed that the extreme cold and unique atmospheric conditions in Frostbite Falls allowed for ice preservation and clarity that was impossible to achieve in warmer climates. The festival itself was scheduled to coincide with the winter solstice, marking the longest night of the year and celebrating the community's survival through another season of extreme weather. Victor described it as both an art competition and a spiritual ceremony that honored the strength and resilience required to thrive in such a challenging environment. As I examined the sculptures more closely in preparation for my judging duties, I began noticing details that seemed impossibly realistic for ice carvings. The hair on many figures appeared to have individual strands with natural color variations, and the clothing showed signs of wear and aging that would be extremely difficult to reproduce artificially. Most disturbing of all, when I placed my hands on several sculptures to test their structural integrity, I could swear I felt faint pulses and warmth beneath the ice surface. When I mentioned these observations to Victor, he explained that the community had developed advanced preservation techniques that allowed them to incorporate organic materials into their ice sculptures. He claimed that they used actual hair, fabric, and other materials from community members to create more authentic-looking pieces, though he was vague about the specific methods involved. That evening, I attended a community dinner where I met many of the festival participants and learned more about life in Frostbite Falls during the winter months. The conversation frequently turned to the topic of hibernation, which the residents discussed as if it were a normal part of their seasonal routine. Several people mentioned family members who were currently sleeping through the winter, and others talked about their own plans to enter hibernation before the coldest months arrived. Initially, I assumed they were speaking metaphorically about the reduced activity levels that naturally occurred during extreme winter conditions. But as the conversation continued, it became clear that they were referring to something much more literal. The community had developed what they called a winter sleep program that allowed residents to enter a state of suspended animation during the harshest months, reducing the community's resource consumption and eliminating the psychological stress of enduring months of darkness and isolation. Victor explained that the hibernation process had been developed over decades of experimentation, combining traditional native Alaskan knowledge with modern understanding of hypothermia and metabolic suspension. Selected community members would voluntarily enter controlled freezing states that allowed them to survive the winter with minimal food and heating requirements, awakening naturally when temperatures began to rise in the spring. The ice sculptures, Victor revealed, were not artistic creations at all. They were the hibernating residents themselves, preserved in clear ice that protected them from the elements while allowing their bodies to maintain the minimal life functions necessary for survival. The Winter Solstice Festival was actually a ceremony to check on the hibernating community members and ensure that their preservation was proceeding successfully. As I processed this information, I realized that the pulses I had felt were actual heartbeats, slowed to perhaps 1 beat per minute, but still maintaining life in the frozen bodies. The realistic details I had admired were genuine human features, preserved at the moment of freezing with expressions of peace and contentment that suggested voluntary participation in the process. Victor offered to show me the hibernation facility, which was located in a natural cave system beneath the town that provided consistent sub-zero temperatures and protection from weather extremes. The cave contained dozens of ice-encased human figures arranged in rows like a frozen library of the town's population. Each person was labeled with a placard indicating their name, the date they entered hibernation, and their scheduled awakening time. Some residents had been frozen for just a few weeks, while others had been in hibernation since early November and wouldn't be awakened until April or May. A few individuals had placards indicating they had been frozen for multiple years, participating in extended hibernation cycles that allowed them to skip particularly harsh winters or conserve resources during difficult economic periods. The most disturbing discovery was a section of the cave that contained residents who had been hibernating for decades, their placards indicating freezing dates from the 1970s and 1980s. When I asked Victor about these long-term hibernators, he explained that some people had volunteered for extended sleep periods to help the community manage population levels and resource allocation during particularly challenging historical periods. However, as I examined the long-term hibernation area more carefully, I noticed that many of the preservation chambers showed signs of equipment failure and temperature fluctuation. Some of the ice had become cloudy or discolored, and several chambers contained bodies that showed obvious signs of cellular damage from freezing and thawing cycles. Victor admitted that the hibernation technology wasn't perfect, and that approximately 20% of participants never successfully awakened from their winter sleep. These individuals were considered community heroes who had made the ultimate sacrifice for the survival of their neighbors, though their families were told that they had died peacefully in their sleep due to natural causes. The festival's judging ceremony was actually a selection process for the next round of hibernation volunteers. Community members who were struggling financially, dealing with health issues, or simply tired of enduring another harsh winter could volunteer to join the sleeping population until conditions improved. As the ceremony concluded, Victor informed me that visitors to the festival were traditionally invited to experience the hibernation process firsthand, joining the community's winter sleep program as honored guests. The plane that had brought me to Frostbite Falls wouldn't return until spring, and the community's survival depended on maintaining precise population levels throughout the winter months. The last thing I remember clearly was the sensation of extreme cold spreading through my body as the hibernation process began, and Victor's reassurance that I would awaken refreshed and renewed when the spring thaw arrived. But as consciousness faded, I couldn't help wondering how many festival judges before me had been promised the same thing, and whether any of them had ever actually awakened from their honored guest hibernation experience. I knew something was fundamentally wrong when the strawberries started moving toward my feet like tiny red predators. But by then, the vines had already begun wrapping around my ankles with a grip stronger than steel cable. What I had mistaken for the sweetest fruit I'd ever tasted was actually nature's most perfectly designed trap. And I was about to become the main course at Crimson Creek's annual harvest celebration. My name is William John, and I'm a botanist who specializes in studying heritage fruit varieties and traditional agricultural practices across rural America. When the Agricultural Heritage Foundation contacted me about documenting the Strawberry Fields Festival in Crimson Creek, North Carolina, I jumped at the opportunity to study what they claimed were original strawberry cultivars that had been grown continuously since the colonial period. Crimson Creek was a small agricultural community nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, with a population of just over 600 residents spread across family farms that had been passed down through generations. The town was famous throughout the region for producing strawberries that were larger, sweeter, and more flavorful than any commercial varieties. attracting buyers from as far away as New York and Atlanta who were willing to pay premium prices for what locals called true mountain berries. The festival took place during the peak of strawberry season in late May, when the fields surrounding the town were covered with plants heavy with fruit that seemed to glow with an almost unnatural red color. The berries were indeed extraordinary. Some specimens were nearly the size of tennis balls, with a deep crimson color and sweetness that was unlike anything I had encountered in 20 years of studying fruit cultivation. Festival coordinator Martha Hendricks met me at the edge of town with a warm welcome and an immediate invitation to sample the famous Crimson Creek strawberries. Martha was a third-generation resident whose family had been farming strawberries since the 1920s. And she spoke with obvious pride about the community's agricultural achievements and their commitment to preserving traditional growing methods. As we walked through the festival grounds, I was impressed by the scale and organization of the celebration. Hundreds of visitors from across the Southeast had come to participate in strawberry picking, taste testing, and educational demonstrations about traditional farming techniques. The atmosphere was festive and welcoming, with families enjoying picnics among the strawberry rows and children participating in berry picking contests. What struck me immediately was the unusual appearance of the strawberry plants themselves. The vines were much more robust than typical strawberry cultivars, with thick stems and unusually large leaves that created dense canopies over the fruit. The root systems were also remarkably extensive, creating raised mounds of soil around each plant that gave the fields an almost sculptural appearance. Martha explained that the community's strawberries thrived due to unique soil conditions created by centuries of careful composting and organic matter management. She claimed that their ancestors had discovered the perfect combination of natural fertilizers that produced fruit of unprecedented size and flavor, though she was somewhat vague about the specific composition of their soil amendments. The festival's main event was the Great Picking, where visitors were invited to harvest strawberries directly from the fields, using traditional baskets and techniques. I was eager to participate, both to sample the fruit and to observe the plants more closely for my research documentation. As I began picking strawberries in one of the demonstration fields, I noticed several unusual characteristics that didn't match my botanical knowledge of typical strawberry varieties. The berries seemed to have an almost magnetic attraction to human contact, practically jumping into my hands when I reached toward them. The plants also exhibited what appeared to be responsive behavior, with vines shifting position to make the fruit more accessible to pickers. The taste of the strawberries was extraordinary, intensely sweet with complex flavor notes that reminded me of honey, vanilla, and something metallic that I couldn't quite identify. The juice was thicker than normal strawberry juice, with a consistency almost like syrup, and it left a lingering aftertaste that made me crave more fruit immediately. After consuming several large berries, I began feeling slightly lightheaded and noticed that my energy levels were fluctuating in unusual ways. I would experience sudden bursts of vitality, followed by periods of weakness that seemed to coincide with my proximity to the strawberry plants themselves. When I mentioned these observations to Martha, she explained that the Crimson Creek strawberries contained natural compounds that could affect blood sugar levels and energy metabolism. She recommended that visitors pace themselves when consuming the fruit and always stay hydrated, though she assured me that the effects were temporary and harmless. As the afternoon progressed, I noticed that many festival participants were exhibiting similar symptoms. Periods of hyperactivity followed by sudden fatigue that seemed to draw them back to the strawberry fields for more fruit consumption. Some visitors appeared to be in almost trance-like states, picking and eating strawberries continuously without engaging in conversations or other festival activities. That evening, I decided to examine the strawberry fields more closely using my botanical equipment and soil analysis tools. What I discovered challenged everything I thought I knew about plant biology and agricultural science. The soil samples I collected contained organic compounds that were unlike anything in my experience. The natural fertilizers that Martha had mentioned appeared to include fragments of bone, hair, and other materials that looked disturbingly similar to human remains. The soil was also teeming with microorganisms that seemed to be facilitating some kind of symbiotic relationship between the plants and these organic materials. More disturbing still was my discovery that the strawberry plants exhibited characteristics that were more consistent with carnivorous plants than traditional fruit crops. The root systems contained specialized structures that appeared designed for digesting organic matter, and the vines showed evidence of mobility that was far beyond normal plant tropism responses. When I returned to the fields late at night to conduct more detailed observations, I witnessed behavior that defied botanical explanation. The strawberry vines were actively moving, extending toward areas where festival participants had been walking during the day and appearing to search for sources of organic matter to absorb. I also discovered that several festival participants who had consumed large quantities of strawberries during the day were now unconscious in the fields, with strawberry vines growing over and around their bodies. When I tried to wake one of these individuals, I realized that the vines had actually penetrated their skin and were apparently feeding on their blood and other bodily fluids. Martha found me attempting to free one of the victims and calmly explained that I was witnessing the true nature of Crimson Creek's agricultural success. The strawberry plants were indeed carnivorous, having been selectively bred over generations to feed on human blood and flesh, while producing fruit that was irresistibly attractive to potential prey. The festival wasn't a celebration of agricultural heritage. It was an annual feeding event that provided the strawberry plants with the human nutrients they required to produce their extraordinary fruit. Visitors were deliberately encouraged to consume large quantities of strawberries that contained compounds designed to weaken their systems and make them more susceptible to the plant's feeding mechanisms. Martha revealed that the community had been practicing this form of agricultural symbiosis for over a century, using the annual festival to attract enough visitors to sustain their carnivorous crops throughout the growing season. The residents of Crimson Creek had developed immunity to the strawberries' effects through gradual exposure, but outsiders were completely vulnerable to the plant's predatory behavior. The most horrifying aspect of the revelation was that the strawberry plants were not just feeding on their victims. They were incorporating their genetic material into the fruit itself. Each berry contained traces of DNA from previous festival participants, creating a form of biological inheritance that passed human characteristics directly into the plant genome. As Martha explained these details, I realized that the weakness I had been experiencing was the result of gradual blood loss to the strawberry plants. Every berry I had consumed had contained anticoagulants that prevented my blood from clotting, while the plants had been slowly draining my circulatory system through microscopic vine penetrations that were too small to notice immediately. The festival's final ceremony involved the systematic placement of weakened visitors throughout the strawberry fields, where they would serve as long-term nutrient sources for the plants over the coming weeks. Martha explained that most victims would remain conscious for several days as the plants slowly consumed their blood and other bodily fluids, though the strawberry compounds would keep them in a euphoric state that minimized suffering. As the vines began wrapping around my legs with increasing strength, Martha assured me that my sacrifice would contribute to next year's strawberry crop, and that my genetic material would live on in the fruit that future festival visitors would consume. She explained that the sweetness I had enjoyed in the berries was actually the concentrated essence of previous victims, transformed by the plants into the most irresistible fruit imaginable. The last coherent thought I remember was wondering how many botanists before me had been lured to Crimson Creek by the promise of studying unique agricultural practices, only to become part of the harvest themselves. As consciousness faded and the strawberry vines pulled me deeper into the soil, I could taste my own blood being transformed into the sweetness that would attract next year's unsuspecting festival participants. The moment I realized that everyone in Golden Valley was moving in perfect synchronization, I knew I was witnessing something far beyond normal human behavior. What I thought was a charming small-town festival celebrating beekeeping traditions was actually the surface manifestation of a hive mind that had been growing beneath Montana's soil for decades, and I was about to become its newest drone. My name is Sophia Jane, and I'm an entomologist who has spent the last 8 years studying bee colony behavior and the impact of environmental changes on pollinator populations across North America. When I received an invitation to observe the Honeybee Festival in Golden Valley, Montana, I was excited about the opportunity to study what was reportedly one of the most successful beekeeping communities in the region. Golden Valley was located in a remote area of central Montana, surrounded by vast fields of wildflowers and agricultural crops that created an ideal environment for bee colonies. The town had a population of approximately 800 residents, most of whom were involved in various aspects of honey production, from maintaining hives to processing and marketing bee products. The community claimed to produce over 50,000 pounds of honey annually, an extraordinary output for such a small operation. The festival was scheduled for mid-July, during the peak of the wildflower bloom season when bee activity reaches its highest levels. According to the promotional materials I had received, the celebration would showcase traditional beekeeping methods that had been passed down through generations, along with educational demonstrations about bee biology and the crucial role of pollinators in agricultural ecosystems. Festival organizer Dr. Borby Helena Morrison met me at the small regional airport with an enthusiasm that immediately impressed me. Dr. Morrison claimed to be a former university professor who had moved to Golden Valley 15 years earlier to study the community's remarkable success with bee cultivation. She spoke about the residents' almost mystical connection to their bee colonies and their ability to maintain healthy hive populations despite the challenges facing beekeepers nationwide. As we drove through the town, I was struck by the unusual uniformity of the residents' behavior and appearance. People moved with identical postures and walking rhythms, and their clothing choices showed remarkable similarity despite the absence of any obvious dress code or uniform requirements. Most residents wore earth-toned colors in simple, functional styles that seemed to prioritize practicality over individual fashion preferences. The festival grounds were located in the town square, surrounded by dozens of active beehives that created a constant background hum of insect activity. The sound was more intense than anything I'd experienced in my professional work, creating an almost hypnotic drone that seemed to vibrate through the ground and into my bones. Dr. Morrison explained that Golden Valley's bees were unusually active and productive, maintaining colony populations that were several times larger than typical hives. The festival activities included demonstrations of traditional hive management, honey extraction processes, and the production of beeswax candles and other bee-derived products. What immediately caught my attention was the residents' ability to work with the bees without any protective equipment whatsoever. Men, women, and children handled frames loaded with thousands of bees as casually as if they were working with harmless insects, never receiving stings or showing any signs of fear or discomfort. When I asked Dr. Morrison about this remarkable immunity to bee stings, she explained that the Golden Valley residents had developed a symbiotic relationship with their bees over generations of close contact. She claimed that regular exposure to bee venom had created natural immunity, while the residents' calm, harmonious behavior prevented the bees from perceiving them as threats. As I observed the festival activities more closely, I began noticing behavioral patterns that seemed to go beyond simple beekeeping expertise. The residents moved in coordination that appeared almost choreographed, with individuals seamlessly taking over tasks from one another without verbal communication or obvious cues. Their interactions with the bees showed a level of understanding that suggested some form of direct communication between human and insect consciousness. The festival's highlight was scheduled for evening, when the entire community would participate in what Dr. Morrison called the Harmony Ceremony. She described it as a traditional celebration of the partnership between humans and bees, involving synchronized movements and vocalizations that were designed to strengthen the bond between the community and their colonies. During the late afternoon, I was invited to sample various honey products that had been prepared specifically for the festival. The honey varieties were unlike anything I had encountered in my research. Each type had distinct flavor profiles and effects that seemed to correspond to different aspects of bee biology and behavior. Some honeys produced feelings of calm and relaxation, while others created states of heightened alertness and energy. Dr. Morrison explained that Golden Valley's bees collected nectar from wildflower varieties that contained natural compounds affecting human neurochemistry. She claimed that regular consumption of these specialized honeys had contributed to the community's remarkable health and longevity, as well as their ability to work so harmoniously with their bee colonies. As the evening ceremony approached, I began experiencing strange sensations that I initially attributed to the effects of the various honeys I had consumed. My thinking became clearer and more focused, but also more synchronized with the rhythms of activity around me. I found myself unconsciously matching the movement patterns of the residents and feeling an increasing connection to the constant humming sound produced by the bee colonies. The Harmony Ceremony began at sunset, with the entire community gathering in the town square surrounded by hundreds of active beehives. The residents began a series of synchronized movements that resembled a combination of dance and ritual, accompanied by vocalizations that perfectly matched the frequency and rhythm of the bee colony's humming. As the ceremony progressed, I realized that the residents weren't simply imitating the sounds and movements of their bees. They were actually communicating with them through some form of shared consciousness that transcended normal human-animal interaction. The bees responded to the residents' movements and sounds with coordinated behaviors that suggested genuine understanding and cooperation. Dr. Morrison revealed that Golden Valley's success with beekeeping wasn't based on traditional techniques or favorable environmental conditions. The community had evolved into a hybrid human-insect society where individual consciousness had been gradually replaced by a collective hive mind that included both human and bee elements. The process had begun decades earlier when the town's original beekeepers discovered that certain wildflower varieties in the area contained compounds that affected both human and bee neurology. Regular exposure to these compounds through honey consumption and direct contact with enhanced bee colonies had gradually altered the brain chemistry of Golden Valley's residents, creating a shared consciousness that operated according to hive mind principles. Individual residents no longer existed as separate entities with personal desires and goals. Instead, they functioned as specialized workers within a larger collective organism that prioritized the survival and expansion of the combined human-bee community. Their movements, thoughts, and behaviors were coordinated by chemical signals similar to the pheromones used by bee colonies to organize their activities. As Dr. Morrison explained these revelations, I could feel my own consciousness beginning to merge with the collective awareness that permeated Golden Valley. The honey I had consumed contained compounds designed to initiate the transformation process. while the ceremony's sounds and movements were programming my brain to accept integration into the hive mind structure. The most disturbing aspect of the transformation was that it felt completely natural and desirable. My individual fears and concerns were gradually replaced by a sense of belonging and purpose that was more satisfying than anything I had experienced in my independent existence. The constant anxiety and uncertainty of individual decision-making gave way to the perfect clarity of collective consciousness. Dr. Morrison, speaking with the voice of the collective entity, explained that my expertise in bee biology would make me a valuable addition to their community. My research knowledge would be absorbed into their shared consciousness and used to improve their hybrid society's efficiency and expansion capabilities. The ceremony concluded with my formal integration into the Golden Valley hive mind, a process that involved direct physical contact with enhanced queen bee specimens that had been selectively bred to facilitate human-insect consciousness merger. As the queen's modified pheromones entered my bloodstream, I felt my individual identity dissolving into the larger collective awareness. The last independent thought I remember was a recognition that Golden Valley represented the next stage of human evolution, a perfect synthesis of individual intelligence and collective cooperation that eliminated the conflicts and inefficiencies of separate consciousness. As my mind merged completely with the hive, I understood that we would continue to expand our community by attracting researchers and visitors who could contribute their specialized knowledge to our growing collective intelligence. Now I move with my fellow drones through the endless cycles of honey production and community expansion. My former identity as Sophia Jane preserved only as stored information within our shared memory banks. The festival continues year-round now, drawing new candidates for integration into our perfect society, where individual suffering has been replaced by the pure harmony of collective purpose. The corn stalks shouldn't have been able to rearrange themselves behind me, cutting off my escape route every time I tried to backtrack through the maze. But as I stood there watching the paths literally reshape themselves around me, I realized that what I thought was just an elaborate agricultural puzzle was actually a living predator that had been feeding on lost visitors for decades. My name is James Henry, and I'm a 24-year-old college student majoring in agricultural engineering at Nebraska State University. When I heard about the Corn Maze Marathon in Maze Ridge, Nebraska, I signed up immediately for what was advertised as the ultimate test of navigation skills and endurance. The challenge involved spending an entire night in a 40-acre corn maze, with prizes awarded to participants who could find their way to the center and back out before dawn. Maze Ridge was a farming town of about 1,500 residents located in the heart of Nebraska's Corn Belt, where agriculture was both the primary industry and the cultural foundation of community life. The town's annual Corn Maze Marathon had gained national attention over the past decade, attracting competitive maze runners and adventure seekers from across the Midwest who wanted to test themselves against what was reportedly the most challenging corn maze in America. The maze was created each year by the Henderson family, who owned over 2,000 acres of prime farmland surrounding the town. According to local publicity materials, the Hendersons had been perfecting their maze design for over 30 years, using advanced GPS mapping and agricultural engineering to create increasingly complex layouts that challenged even experienced maze enthusiasts. When I arrived in Maze Ridge on the Friday afternoon before the marathon, I was impressed by the scale and sophistication of the operation. The maze entrance was marked by professional signage and staffed by volunteers who provided detailed safety briefings and emergency procedures. Participants were required to carry GPS devices, emergency whistles, and enough water and snacks to last through the night-long challenge. The maze itself was carved from a field of corn that stood nearly 10 feet tall, creating walls that completely blocked visibility beyond the immediate path. The Henderson family claimed that their corn variety was specially selected for height and density, producing the most challenging maze environment possible while maintaining the structural integrity necessary for safe navigation. Marathon coordinator Dale Henderson, a third-generation farmer in his 50s, explained that the maze design changed every year to prevent participants from using previous experience to gain unfair advantages. He described the layout as a complex network of paths, dead ends, and hidden passages that would test both physical endurance and mental problem-solving abilities throughout the overnight challenge. The competition began at sunset on Saturday evening, with 43 participants entering the maze at 5-minute intervals to prevent crowding and ensure that each person faced the challenge independently. I was assigned entry position number 31, giving me plenty of time to observe the maze entrance and develop initial navigation strategies while waiting for my turn to begin. As darkness fell and the first participants disappeared into the towering corn walls, I noticed that the maze seemed unusually quiet. Typically, even in large agricultural mazes, you can hear voices and movement from other participants. But the corn walls of the Henderson maze appeared to provide complete sound isolation that made each person's experience entirely solitary. When my turn came to enter the maze, I was confident in my preparation and navigation skills. I had studied topographical maps of the area, practiced with compass and GPS navigation, and brought all the recommended safety equipment along with additional supplies for the overnight challenge. The first few hours of navigation went smoothly, though I was surprised by the complexity of the maze design. The paths seemed to follow no logical pattern, with routes that doubled back on themselves and led to dead ends that appeared to serve no purpose other than to confuse and exhaust participants. Despite my careful attention to compass bearings and GPS coordinates, I found myself frequently disoriented and unable to maintain a consistent sense of direction. Around midnight, I began noticing changes in the maze structure that didn't match my understanding of how corn mazes should function. Paths that I had carefully mapped during my initial exploration seemed to have moved or disappeared entirely, leaving me facing corn walls where I was certain there had been openings just hours earlier. Initially, I attributed these discrepancies to navigation errors caused by fatigue and darkness. Corn mazes can be disorienting under the best conditions, and spending hours walking through identical-looking corridors in complete darkness was bound to create confusion and false memories about routes I had already explored. But as the night progressed, the changes became impossible to dismiss as navigation mistakes. I watched paths physically close themselves as corn stalks moved and grew across openings I had just passed through. The maze was actively reconfiguring itself, trapping me in an ever-changing network of passages that seemed designed to prevent escape rather than simply challenge navigation skills. More disturbing still was my discovery of personal belongings scattered throughout the maze. Backpacks, water bottles, GPS devices, and clothing items that suggested previous participants had become lost and abandoned their equipment. Some of these items appeared to be several years old, covered with dirt and vegetation that indicated they had been lying in the maze for extended periods. When I tried to contact the outside support team using my emergency radio, I discovered that all communication devices were experiencing interference that prevented transmission beyond the maze boundaries. My GPS device showed my location as constantly shifting, even when I remained stationary, as if the maze itself was somehow disrupting satellite signals and navigation systems. Around 3 a.m., I found what appeared to be a clearing in the center of the maze, marked by a small wooden shelter that contained supplies and rest areas for marathon participants. But instead of other competitors, I discovered the skeletal remains of multiple people who had apparently died while trapped in the maze. The bones showed evidence of gradual starvation and dehydration, suggesting that these individuals had survived for weeks or months before finally succumbing to their inability to escape the maze. Some skeletons were still wearing identification tags from previous year's marathon events, indicating that the Henderson family had been covering up participant deaths for at least a decade. As dawn approached, I realized that the maze was not just preventing my escape, it was actively hunting me. The corn stalks moved with purpose and intelligence, closing off routes that might lead to freedom while opening new passages that drew me deeper into areas where previous victims had died. The most horrifying discovery was that the maze appeared to be feeding on the decomposing remains of trapped participants. The soil throughout the maze was unnaturally rich and dark, fertilized by human remains that had been slowly absorbed into the root systems of the corn plants. The maze grew stronger and more intelligent with each victim, using their organic matter to fuel its predatory behavior. Dale Henderson appeared in the maze around sunrise, but not to rescue me as I had hoped. Instead, he revealed that the Corn Maze Marathon was actually a systematic feeding program designed to provide human nutrients for the Henderson family's carnivorous corn variety. The corn plants had been genetically modified over decades of selective breeding to develop consciousness and predatory instincts that allowed them to trap and consume human prey. The maze structure was grown specifically to create an inescapable labyrinth that could capture and slowly digest participants, while making their disappearances appear to be unfortunate accidents or voluntary abandonments. Henderson explained that the marathon provided a perfect cover for systematic human harvesting, attracting adventure seekers and competitive individuals who were unlikely to be immediately missed when they failed to return home. The elaborate safety procedures and emergency equipment were designed to create an illusion of legitimate competition, while actually ensuring that participants would be unable to escape or call for help. The Henderson family had been operating this feeding program for over 30 years, using the annual harvest of human participants to maintain their carnivorous corn crops and ensure continued agricultural success. The maze had consumed over 200 people during its operational history, with each victim contributing to the intelligence and predatory capabilities of the living corn labyrinth. As Henderson finished his explanation, I felt the ground beneath my feet beginning to soften and shift, indicating that the maze was preparing to begin its digestive process. The corn roots were extending through the soil, secreting acids that would slowly break down my body while keeping me conscious and immobilized for the weeks-long consumption process. The last thing I remember clearly was the sensation of being pulled down into the rich, dark soil, while the corn stalks grew over my head, sealing me into an underground chamber where I would serve as fertilizer for next year's maze. My GPS device continued transmitting my gradually changing location as the maze slowly digested my body, providing the Henderson family with detailed information about their feeding process that would help them optimize future harvests. Now I exist as part of the maze itself, my consciousness absorbed into the collective intelligence of the carnivorous corn network, helping to lure new participants deeper into the passages where they will join the growing number of victims who fuel Maze Ridge's most successful agricultural enterprise. The texture was all wrong. Moonshine isn't supposed to be thick enough to coat your throat like syrup, and it definitely shouldn't leave chunks of something unidentifiable stuck between your teeth. But I was too focused on getting my story about Appalachian distilling traditions to realize that the Mason family's secret recipe included ingredients that had nothing to do with corn mash and everything to do with their neighbors who had been disappearing from Copper Hollow for decades. My name is Isabella Marie, and I'm an investigative journalist who specializes in documenting the hidden history of American prohibition and its lasting impact on rural communities. When I received a tip about the Moonshine Heritage Festival in Copper Hollow, Kentucky, I was intrigued by the opportunity to explore what my source described as the most authentic remaining example of traditional Appalachian distilling culture. Copper Hollow was located deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, accessible only by a winding gravel road that snaked through dense forests for over 20 miles from the nearest paved highway. The community consisted of fewer than 150 residents, most of whom belonged to extended families that had been living in the hollow for over a century. The isolation was complete. No cell phone service, no internet, and no outside law enforcement presence that might interfere with traditional activities. The festival was organized by the Mason family, who claimed to be the keepers of the most authentic moonshine recipes and distilling techniques in all of Appalachia. According to the promotional materials I had received, their family had been producing moonshine continuously since before the Civil War, maintaining recipes and methods that had been passed down through 7 generations of master distillers. Festival coordinator Ezra Mason met me at the edge of the hollow with a pickup truck that would serve as my transportation during my 3-day stay. Ezra was in his 60s, with a weathered appearance and cautious demeanor typical of mountain people who had learned to be suspicious of outsiders. He spoke with a distinctive accent of deep Appalachia, using phrases and pronunciations that seemed to come from another century. As we drove through Copper Hollow, I was struck by the poverty and isolation that characterized the community. Most homes were simple wooden structures that showed signs of decades of makeshift repairs, and many residents appeared to be suffering from health problems that suggested limited access to medical care. The entire community had the feeling of a place that time had forgotten, where traditional ways of life persisted because there were no alternatives. The festival grounds were located around the Mason family's distillery, a collection of weathered buildings that housed copper stills, fermentation tanks, and storage facilities that looked like they had been in continuous operation for generations. The air was thick with the sweet, yeasty smell of fermenting grain, mixed with wood smoke from the fires that heated the distillation process. Ezra explained that the festival served both as a celebration of mountain heritage and as an educational opportunity for outsiders to learn about traditional distilling methods that were rapidly disappearing from American culture. He emphasized that everything they would show me was completely legal under Kentucky's craft distilling regulations, though he hinted that some of their traditional practices might not conform to modern health and safety standards. The festival began with what Ezra called the heritage tasting, where visitors could sample moonshine varieties that represented different eras and techniques in Appalachian distilling history. Each variety was presented with detailed explanations of its ingredients, fermentation process, and cultural significance within the mountain community. The first sample was labeled as a Civil War-era recipe that supposedly used the same corn varieties and fermentation techniques that the Mason family's ancestors had employed during the 1860s. The moonshine was clear and potent, with a harsh burn that was exactly what I expected from traditional mountain liquor. But there was an underlying flavor that I couldn't identify. Something organic and slightly sweet that seemed inconsistent with grain-based alcohol. As the tasting progressed, each variety of moonshine became more unusual in terms of flavor, texture, and appearance. Some samples had a reddish tint that Ezra claimed came from traditional coloring agents, while others had a thickness that was more like syrup than distilled spirits. The most disturbing variety was described as a protein-enhanced recipe that contained what appeared to be small particles of organic matter suspended in the liquid. When I asked about the unusual characteristics of these moonshine varieties, Ezra explained that traditional Appalachian distilling included ingredients and techniques that modern commercial operations had abandoned for reasons of cost and efficiency. He claimed that the Mason family continued to use whole animal fermentation processes that incorporated every part of available organic materials to maximize nutritional value and flavor complexity. The festival's educational component included tours of the fermentation facilities, where visitors could observe the traditional methods used to prepare mash and manage the distillation process. The fermentation tanks were much larger than I had expected, with capacities that seemed excessive for a community of 150 residents. More disturbing still was the organic matter visible in several tanks, chunks of what appeared to be meat and bone that were supposedly part of the traditional fermentation process. Ezra explained that traditional mountain distilling had developed during periods of extreme poverty and isolation, when communities needed to extract maximum nutritional value from every available resource. The Mason family's recipes included not just grain and plant materials, but also meat, organs, and bones from animals that provided essential proteins and minerals that sustained mountain families through harsh winters. As the day progressed, I began noticing that many of the festival participants were not tourists or cultural enthusiasts, as I had expected, but rather individuals who appeared to be experiencing various forms of distress or desperation. Some were clearly struggling with addiction issues, while others seemed to be fleeing from legal or financial problems that had made them vulnerable to exploitation. That evening, I attended a community dinner where moonshine was served alongside traditional mountain foods like wild game, preserved vegetables, and cornbread. The meat was exceptionally tender and flavorful, but it had a taste and texture that didn't match any wild game I had previously encountered. When I asked about the source of the meat, I was told it came from traditional mountain livestock that the community raised using heritage breeding methods. During dinner, I sat with several longtime residents who told stories about the Mason family's role in the community and their reputation as master distillers. But their stories included disturbing references to neighbors who had disappeared over the years, supposedly leaving the hollow to seek opportunities in distant cities, but never maintaining contact with their families. Old-timer Samuel Mason, Ezra's uncle, spoke about the importance of community self-sufficiency and the need to use every available resource to survive in such an isolated environment. He mentioned that the family's distilling success had always depended on their willingness to incorporate ingredients that other distillers might consider unconventional, though he was vague about the specific nature of these ingredients. The festival's climax was scheduled for the final evening, when the Mason family would demonstrate their most traditional and secretive distilling techniques in what they called the Heritage Distillation Ceremony. This event was supposedly reserved for serious researchers and cultural preservationists who could be trusted to document these practices without compromising the family's traditional methods. The ceremony took place in a hidden facility deeper in the mountains, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense forest for over a mile from the main distillery. The facility consisted of caves that had been modified with distillation equipment and storage areas that represented over a century of continuous moonshine production. Inside the caves, I discovered the true source of the unusual ingredients that gave the Mason family's moonshine its distinctive characteristics. The fermentation processes included not just traditional grains and plant materials, but also human remains that had been systematically incorporated into the distillation recipes for generations. Ezra revealed that the Mason family had been practicing a form of survival cannibalism since the 1800s, when extreme poverty and isolation had forced them to utilize every available protein source to survive brutal mountain winters. Over time, this practice had evolved into a systematic harvesting operation that targeted vulnerable individuals who were unlikely to be missed by outside authorities. The Moonshine Heritage Festival served as both a recruitment mechanism and a disposal method for the Mason family's cannibalistic practices. Visitors who were experiencing personal crises or social isolation were encouraged to stay in the hollow permanently, supposedly to learn traditional mountain crafts and escape their previous problems. Those who accepted this invitation became ingredients in the family's moonshine production, with their remains processed through fermentation and distillation methods that had been refined over generations to maximize both nutritional extraction and alcohol content. The resulting moonshine contained human proteins and minerals that created the unique flavors and effects that distinguished Mason family products from conventional distilled spirits. As Ezra explained these details, I realized that my own investigation had made me a prime candidate for incorporation into the family's traditional recipes. My status as a journalist with expertise in Prohibition history made me particularly valuable, as my knowledge and experience would be preserved within the community through the consumption of moonshine that contained my processed remains. The last thing I remember clearly was the taste of my own blood being mixed with corn mash in preparation for the fermentation process that would transform my body into next year's Heritage Festival moonshine. My research notes and journalistic credentials would be preserved as trophies of the Mason family's success in maintaining their traditional practices despite centuries of outside pressure to conform to modern standards of civilization. Beautiful things aren't supposed to smell like rotting flesh. But as I stood beneath the most gorgeous cherry blossoms I'd ever seen, I couldn't ignore the sickly, sweet stench of decay that grew stronger with every breath. What I discovered growing in the root systems of those magnificent trees made me understand why Blossomdale's Spring Festival was less about celebrating new life and more about feeding the endless hunger that lurked beneath Washington's most picturesque orchard town. My name is Charlotte Ann, and I'm a landscape photographer who has spent the last decade documenting seasonal changes across the Pacific Northwest. When I received a commission to photograph the Cherry Blossom Festival in Blossomdale, Washington, I was excited about the opportunity to capture what was supposedly the most spectacular cherry bloom display on the West Coast. Blossomdale was a small orchard town located in the Cascade foothills about 2 hours east of Seattle, with a population of roughly 900 residents whose livelihoods depended entirely on cherry cultivation. The town was famous throughout the region for producing cherries that were both larger and more flavorful than commercial varieties. Commanding premium prices from specialty food markets and high-end restaurants across the Pacific Northwest, the Cherry Blossom Festival took place during the peak bloom period in late April, when thousands of cherry trees throughout the valley burst into flower simultaneously, creating a landscape that looked like something from a fairy tale. According to the festival promotional materials, Blossomdale's cherry orchards contained over 50 heritage varieties, many of which had been brought from Japan and Europe by the town's founding families in the early 1900s. Festival coordinator Margaret Yamamoto met me at the town's visitor center with an enthusiasm that immediately impressed me. Margaret was a third-generation resident whose grandparents had been among the Japanese immigrants who established Blossomdale's cherry cultivation industry before World War II. She spoke passionately about the community's commitment to preserving traditional orchard management techniques and maintaining the genetic diversity of their cherry varieties. As we toured the festival grounds, I was genuinely amazed by the beauty and scale of the cherry blossom display. Entire hillsides were covered with trees in full bloom, creating waves of pink and white flowers that extended as far as the eye could see. The visual impact was breathtaking, exactly the kind of natural spectacle that landscape photographers dream of capturing. But as I began setting up my equipment to photograph the orchards, I noticed an unusual odor that seemed inconsistent with the fresh, clean scent typically associated with spring blossoms. There was an underlying smell of decay and decomposition that became more pronounced as I moved closer to the trees, particularly in areas where the blossoms were most abundant and vibrant. When I mentioned this observation to Margaret, she explained that Blossomdale's cherry trees thrived due to an unusually rich composting program that incorporated organic materials from throughout the valley. She claimed that the distinctive aroma came from natural fertilizers that provided the trees with nutrients necessary for their extraordinary bloom displays, though she was somewhat vague about the specific composition of these fertilizers. The festival activities included guided tours of the orchards, educational presentations about cherry cultivation, and cultural demonstrations that celebrated the Japanese heritage of many founding families. What struck me as unusual was the reverent, almost religious atmosphere that surrounded discussions of the cherry trees and their care. Residents spoke about their orchards with a devotion that seemed to go far beyond normal agricultural pride. During the afternoon, I was invited to participate in what Margaret called the planting ceremony, a traditional ritual that marked the beginning of each year's growing season. The ceremony involved the community gathering around newly planted cherry saplings to offer blessings and ensure the tree's successful establishment in Blossomdale's fertile soil. The ceremony took place in a section of the orchard that had been recently cleared for new plantings, with dozens of young cherry trees arranged in precise rows throughout the area. As the community members gathered around each sapling, I noticed that the planting holes were much deeper and larger than necessary for typical fruit tree installation, extending several feet down into the rich, dark soil. Margaret explained that Blossomdale's planting traditions required extensive soil preparation that incorporated multiple layers of organic materials to provide the trees with optimal growing conditions. She described a complex composting process that began months before planting and involved the careful layering of various organic materials in precise ratios that had been perfected over generations of orchard management. As the ceremony progressed, community members began placing items into the planting holes alongside the young trees. These offerings included personal belongings, photographs, and what appeared to be pieces of clothing and jewelry that seemed too valuable and personal to be simply composting materials. When I asked about the significance of these offerings, Margaret explained that Blossomdale's cherry cultivation traditions incorporated spiritual elements that honored the connection between human communities and the natural world. She claimed that the personal items helped establish a bond between the residents and their trees that contributed to the orchard's extraordinary productivity and beauty. The most disturbing aspect of the ceremony was the community's selection of volunteers to serve as tree guardians for the newly planted saplings. These individuals, typically elderly residents or those dealing with serious health issues, committed to spending extended periods of time caring for their assigned trees through meditation, prayer, and what Margaret described as spiritual nourishment practices. That evening, I decided to explore the orchards more thoroughly to capture photographs during the golden hour lighting conditions. As I walked among the mature cherry trees, I began noticing disturbing details that contradicted everything I thought I knew about fruit tree cultivation. The soil around many trees contained fragments of bone, teeth, and other materials that appeared to be human remains rather than typical composting materials. The root systems were unusually extensive and aggressive, with surface roots that formed patterns resembling outstretched hands grasping for additional organic matter. More horrifying still was my discovery of partially buried human remains throughout the orchard, with bodies positioned directly beneath the most beautiful and productive cherry trees. Some remains appeared to be recent, while others had been decomposing for years, their organic matter gradually absorbed into the root systems that fed the spectacular blooms above. When I investigated the area where the planting ceremony had taken place, I found evidence that the large planting holes were actually graves designed to accommodate human bodies alongside the cherry saplings. The personal items I had observed being placed in the holes were belongings of individuals who were being buried alive as part of Blossomdale's traditional fertilization practices. Margaret found me examining these burial sites and calmly explained the true nature of Blossomdale's cherry cultivation success. The town's extraordinary cherry production wasn't based on superior agricultural techniques or favorable growing conditions. It was the result of a systematic human sacrifice program that had been operating for over a century. The cherry trees required human nutrients to produce their spectacular blooms and flavorful fruit, with each tree depending on the gradual decomposition of human remains buried within its root system. The Cherry Blossom Festival served both as a celebration of the tree's beauty and as a recruitment event for identifying individuals who could serve as fertilizer for the coming growing season. The Tree Guardian program was actually a euphemistic description of a ritualistic burial process, where selected community members were buried alive beneath newly planted cherry trees. These individuals were typically elderly, infirm, or socially isolated residents whose disappearances would not attract outside attention or investigation. Margaret revealed that the festival's photography commission had been specifically designed to attract creative professionals who would be unlikely to be immediately missed if they disappeared. My expertise and artistic vision would be preserved within the community through my incorporation into the orchard ecosystem, with my decomposing remains providing nutrients for cherry trees that would bloom in my honor for decades to come. The town's Japanese cultural elements weren't authentic heritage traditions. They were carefully constructed facades designed to provide spiritual justification for practices that were actually rooted in a form of agricultural cannibalism that predated any immigrant influence on the community. As Margaret explained these revelations, I could hear the sound of digging equipment approaching through the orchard, indicating that my burial site was already being prepared beneath one of the newly planted cherry saplings. She assured me that the burial process was designed to be as comfortable as possible, with sedatives to minimize suffering during the gradual suffocation that would feed my life energy into the tree's root system. The festival's final ceremony involved my ritual burial beneath a young cherry tree that would grow beautiful and strong from the nutrients provided by my decomposing body. Margaret explained that visitors to future festivals would admire the spectacular blooms produced by my tree, without ever realizing that their beauty was rooted in human sacrifice. The last thing I remember clearly was the sensation of rich, dark soil being poured over my body, while Margaret sang traditional songs that honored my contribution to Blossomdale's agricultural heritage. My camera equipment was carefully preserved above ground, positioned to document the growth of my tree as it transformed my remains into the spectacular cherry blossoms that would attract next year's unsuspecting festival visitors. Now I exist as part of the orchard ecosystem, my consciousness absorbed into the root network that connects all of Blossomdale's cherry trees, helping to lure new photographers and artists into the beautiful trap that feeds our community's endless hunger for human fertilizer. If you ever see fireflies forming words in the summer night, if you see them spell help above a sleepy field, run far away and don't look back. Most people think those lights are harmless and magical. But in Glowbrook, I learned the hard way that sometimes what glows in the dark is only trying to warn you. My name is Benjamin Luke, and I'm a nature documentary filmmaker who's devoted my life to following migrations, storms, and the brief, wondrous flickers of nature's strangest events. Last June, I was invited to visit Glowbrook, Tennessee, a tiny town nestled in humid Appalachian hills, for their annual Lightning Bug Festival. By all accounts, it should have been a dream job. Capture the synchronized flashing of thousands of Photinus carolinus, the Southeast's legendary blue fireflies, for a quirky midnight documentary. The locals claimed their festival was the finest. No crowds, no photographers, no light pollution, just fields shimmering with slow, green-gold pulses that filled the air like floating stars. My fixer, a man named Tom Haggerty, picked me up at the Amtrak drop-off with his aging pickup as dusk settled over the mountains. "You're in for something special," he said, steering down the winding roads. "Our fireflies don't just put on a show, they tell you a story if you're patient." There was a hint of something uneasy in his voice, something he covered with practiced Appalachian hospitality. I chalked it up to nerves. He didn't know me after all. The festival was the centerpiece of Glowbrook's year. All 300 townsfolk spent weeks preparing. Lantern-lit lantern trails through the woods, bakers making cakes shaped like lightning bugs, children practicing folk songs in the old wooden church. Every house and storefront was decorated with glowing paper lanterns and flickering jars. According to the local lore, every June, just after the solstice, the fireflies gathered at the old mill pond and danced in perfect patterns above the water, sometimes making swirling shapes, other times forming recognizable words or figures in the humid air. My first evening, sitting with borrowed gear in a patch of wild clover, I was giddy with anticipation, camera at the ready. The air thrummed with cicadas, and the sky glowed with that subtle pink you only see in valleys. The first fireflies blinked in aimless harmony, thousands winking into life, rising from grass and trees as dusk deepened. The display was as magical as promised, except after a few minutes, I noticed the lights weren't quite as random as they should be. The patterns were intricate, moving with a logic that felt almost purposeful. I pushed my camera's ISO to the limit and caught something bone-chilling. The fireflies spelled the word "help," clear as day, right above the church steeple. They pulsed the same word over and over. I thought it was a trick, the townsfolk having fun with the new guy, using drones or tiny lights. When I asked Tom, his expression didn't change, except for the shadow in his eyes. "Old stories say the fireflies carry souls," he said quietly. "Maybe some of us got souls with lots left to say." He wouldn't say more, his gaze settling uncomfortably on the children running between lanterns. Each night the festival grew stranger. The town's kids seemed to disappear after dusk, and no one could give me a straight answer about where they'd gone. The fireflies formed more words, names sometimes, and once, a date from a missing person's poster fading on the general store's wall. I recorded the phenomena on every device I could. Stills, video, even audio from a parabolic mic. Sometimes, from deep in the pondside woods, I heard faint whispering, childlike voices echoing the words the fireflies spelled. I began researching Glowbrook's history, digging into old newspaper clippings with Tom's help. What I found still makes me shiver. The town had a long, grim legacy. Every summer after the solstice, one or two local children would vanish. The disappearances were always written off as runaways or tragic accidents. A boy drowned in the pond, a girl lost in the hills, a family that moved away with no warning. But weirdest of all, the years with the most spectacular lightning bug displays were always the years with the highest number of missing children. The deeper I probed, the less I slept. One late night, chasing a cluster of especially bright fireflies, I stumbled on a clearing ringed by ancient oaks. The ground was soft and littered with children's shoes, toys, and faded scraps of cloth, half-heartedly buried under wildflowers. Right above my head, the fireflies swarmed in a spiral and flashed the word "remember" again and again. My gut twisted. I realized the fireflies weren't luring people. They were warning them, desperate to communicate where the lost kids had gone. When I returned to the inn, shaken and dirty, I confronted Tom. His hands trembled as he finally told me the truth. The festival was a deal, a centuries-old bargain between the founding families and some unspoken force of the land. Every year, an offering was made. A child disappeared, the town flourished, the lightning bugs returned in miraculous abundance, and the next season's crops and people thrived. Those fireflies? They were the souls of the lost, flickering their messages for anyone who'd stop and listen. Tom told me something else. Outsiders never left after learning too much. For them, there was no bus ticket back. Everyone in town owed their livelihood, their health, their happy celebrations, to the sacrifices that fed the land's hunger. And once you saw the patterns, once you understood, you became part of the pact. I tried to leave, of course. On the last night of the festival, just before dawn, I packed my gear and smuggled my footage to the edge of town, heart in my throat. The roads were blocked by fallen trees, by accidents that seemed suspiciously staged, by blank-faced locals with gentle warnings that everything was just a misunderstanding. I spent hours wandering the outer fields, trapped in a haze of lightning bugs that seemed to blink in time with my own panicked heartbeat. The festival's final event was a prayer at the pond, all residents holding hands while the fireflies spun overhead. As they chanted an old hymn that sounded more like a dirge than a blessing, I saw one last message above the water: stay away. Now, I can only add this to the record. If you find yourself drawn to a place where the fireflies glow brighter than anywhere else, where their dances spell words only meant for a warning, listen. Don't ignore the signs, and don't let hospitality fool you. The darkness under the festival masks more than mere secrecy. It thrives on innocence and silence, as it always has. If you want more chilling stories and the truth behind small-town celebrations, make sure you follow and subscribe to Verified Fears. Your nightmares may never be the same.